Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. It's another international relations show tonight. My topics are the military, that is to say, the U.S. military says no. Also, the war party plans for the future. Also, defending humanity. And finally, the war of terror. And we'll be getting into the specifics of all of these. Hi, Steve Wolfbrand. How are you? Happy to see you here. I'm going to get right into the first of our topics. Okay, the military says no. Here's a piece from the blog God's Spies by Thomas Newberger, who is an excellent blogger, by the way. Used to blog at under the nom de plume of Publius at Down with Tyranny. But he's very imaginative and very trenchant. He wrote this on September 20th, and there's a video, or part of a video there. An interview of Colonel Wilkerson by the Judge Napolitano on the Judging Freedom podcast. And I commend the whole thing to you, though I'm not going to play it here. Anyway, Tom starts off. The President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy. That's the Constitution of the United States, Article 2, Section 2. Of course, apart from the Army and Navy, we've now added the Air Force and the Space Force. And of course, the President shall also be the Commander-in-Chief of those. Tom says, I found the following news via a piece at Ian Welsh's website, and it struck me as important. Well, I don't want to overplay what it implies. I don't want to underplay it either. And he asks the question, an American coup? Question mark. In a 30-minute interview, Judge Napolitano on September 18th, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, former Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell and critic of America's wars, described a recent event in which Pentagon Chief General Lloyd Austin told President Biden that, in Wilkerson's words, quote, the Pentagon has taken over, essentially, diplomacy as well as any action, military speaking, with regard to both theaters of war, unquote. That means with respect to Ukraine and Israel. Wilkerson added, quote, and so they're now in charge, unquote. Austin, according to this telling, listened, quote, to the people in the bowels of the Pentagon who know the truth, unquote, and forced the president to back down. Biden was serious, we're told, but, quote, took that advice, unquote, except as Wilkerson tells it, it wasn't advice but instruction, quote. No dice, unquote, as Wilkerson characterized the message. Sounds pretty final. Tom says, this is good news and bad news. The good U.S. policy is now to Netanyahu. If you invade Lebanon or attack Iran, you're on your own. And to Zelensky, no to long-range missiles reaching deep into Russia. So we in the world are safer, at least for a while. The bad. Is this a coup? Has the military stood up to the president, forced him to change policy? If the answer is a yes, we're on our way once more to revising the Constitution as practiced, but political parties have already confirmed that the Fourth Amendment can be ignored. That's now the new normal, quote unquote. So what's this encroachment of the Pentagon into foreign policy, if not another, quote, new normal, unquote? Has General MacArthur finally won? And there's a photo from the Detroit News. General MacArthur ousted, fired by Truman for disobeying orders. Whatever the truth, you won't see this reported in what people call the quote news, unquote. But I doubt Wilkerson's sources are wrong. At any rate, we'll know soon enough by the way Zelensky and Netanyahu act. Welcome to the future of U.S. foreign policy. Now, I have to say at this point that, I disagree with the interpretation. I'm sure that Austin was duly polite, to the president in giving him advice. I'm sure it was advice. I'm sure it was expressed in very, very strong terms, probably telling the president, that if he went ahead with the policies he's been following towards Israel, and with respect to Ukraine, that the outcome for the United States, would militarily be very, very bad. And so he was advising against following those policies as they had been followed up to this point. So I really don't think the military has, taken over foreign policy. But I think the military was asked for an advice, asked for an assessment, and it gave an assessment. And that assessment was, quote, no dice, as Wilkerson characterized it. But going further, the Wilkerson exchange in full. The video at the top contains the full Wilkerson interview, cued to start at the conversation between Austin and Biden. I've also printed that exchange below, lightly edited. Emphasis is that of the speaker. I'm going to read it instead of playing it to save a little time. Larry Wilkerson. I think what we're seeing here is another attempt, because 100 planes striked into it by Netanyahu to provoke Hezbollah to some sort of action that he can then declare as warlike to the extent that he can do what he wants to do with them. Even though I'm told with great confidence in the sources that the latest two visits by the Central Command, Unified Commander of NATO, were to tell him, Netanyahu, that he would not be with him in the event of his going to war with Hezbollah that he provoked. Nor will we be with him going to war with Iran that he provoked. And we've made it quite clear that we would know if he provoked it. Judge Napolitano answers, you're speaking of General Kurilla, CENTCOM commander since April 2022. And Wilkerson said, yes. And Judge Napolitano said, so Scott Ritter agrees with you. Doug McGregor says he can't imagine Austin and Blinken letting General Kurilla do that. It's very, very interesting. Is this speculation on your part, or is it based on sources? Here I have to interject that we also went over the opinion in the last stream of Professor Doctorow that Scott Ritter, and Doug McGregor were exaggerating the seriousness of the situation. Anyway, Larry Wilkerson says it's based on some pretty reliable sources. And here's the bigger picture, and I hope the others told you this too. Biden's fury, and you could see it, he was seething when he met with the British Prime Minister, I'll add here, uh, Keir Starmer. Okay, and Judge Napolitano said, yes, we have that clip. He was out of control with anger. Larry Wilkerson said, and he had just been told, apparently, what he had just been told, apparently, was by the Pentagon, no dice, Mr. President, no dice on Ukraine, no dice on Gaza. We're in charge now, unquote. But Judge Napolitano says, no dice? You're talking about no dice on the long-range missiles reaching deep into Russia, even though Tony Blinken had intimated all week in Kyiv with his British counterpart this was happening. And Sir Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, had every reason to believe as he's flying across the Atlantic that Joe Biden's answer would be yes. And Wilkerson said he was embarrassed. He was embarrassed by the fact he was pulling out his maps with target data, and Biden told him, quote, don't even pull them out. We're not going to talk about that, unquote. I've been told again by fairly reliable sources that Blinken and Sullivan, Blinken primarily, but Sullivan too, have been sidetracked. And what's happened is the Pentagon has taken over essentially diplomacy as well as any action of any sort of action of a military nature with regard to both theaters of war. And so they're now in charge. I have to change my evaluation of Secretary Austin, if that's the case, because it means he listened finally to the people in the bowels of the Pentagon who know the truth, and he's reacting to that, and he's told President Biden that, and to Biden's credit, even though he was furious, he finally took that advice. And so Judge Napolitano asks, Colonel, you once ran the State Department as Secretary Colin Powell's chief of staff under George Bush. How does the Defense Department engage in diplomacy? Larry Wilkerson says they engage in diplomacy every day. Every day. There are 4 stars in the various sanctums, the regions that they control, the areas of responsibility, who are the true U.S. Diplomats. Some of them are very good at it. I saw some of them. I worked with some of them who are very good at it, better than any Secretary of State. And Larry then says, but it shouldn't be that way. That's a parenthetical remark. We shouldn't have the military leading diplomacy, but we often do. And the Japanese Prime Minister once told me why to my face. He said, quote, Larry, when your East Asia and Pacific Assistant Secretary comes out here, he's not got anything but his briefcase. When the man from Honolulu comes out here from Camp Smith in Hawaii, he's towing air wings, submarines, battle groups, also marine amphibious groups, army divisions. I listen to him. This is the Prime Minister of Japan. As Judge Napolitano said, who told General Carrillo to tell Prime Minister Netanyahu, quote, if you invade Lebanon, you're on your own, unquote. Wilkerson said, it was, I think, Secretary Austin. But that's the chain of command. Austin conveyed that message to him, Carrillo. But I think it was Austin that convinced Biden to give him that command so he could transmit it to Carrillo. And that's the end of that quote. So it does raise the question that Tom Neuberger has brought up. Is the Pentagon really in charge? Or was this just very compelling advice that was given to Biden because it came in the context of a briefing that gave chapter and verse to Biden about what the military situation was. Well, I suspect and hope, it was actually the latter, and that from a constitutional point of view, it was perfectly fine. But I agree with Larry Wilkerson that it's not the proper way for things to be done. The State Department is supposed to lead our diplomacy. It's not supposed to be the Defense Department. We have to somehow restore the balance. And this blog raises that problem and raises the question of how we restore the balance. I guess I'd say maybe we don't rely on the military in the first place so much to structure things. We don't call in the military every chance we get when there's a crisis in the world. Maybe we don't send in the carriers, and we don't send in the battle groups, and we don't send in all those tools of war, but we send in the diplomats to talk. So there's Evelina and Steve, and we have a number of people who are probably on Twitter who have not announced themselves as yet. I'm going to take this opportunity to share this on Facebook. And hopefully it'll get us a larger audience tonight, because I think this video is pretty damned important. So there it is. Maybe we'll see more people from Facebook now. It says we do have a number of other people on Facebook, even though the indicator I have here is showing only 8 people. But here we go to our second topic, which is no war plans. That comes out of a piece by Patrick Lawrence. Which was originally published at Sheer Post, but I saw it at the UN's Review. It's dated September 18th, 2024, and entitled, "The War Party Makes Its Plans." Patrick Lawrence is another very good blogger on foreign policy. Here is Joe Biden, also Kamala Harris, and General C.Q. Brown Jr., who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They participate in a 9/11 wreath-laying ceremony alongside President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris and Secretary of Defense Lloyd J. Austin III at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., September 11th, 2024. This is a DOD photo by the Chief of Mass Communication Specialist. His name is James Mullen. The Biden White House and the Democratic Party machine trying to advance Kamala Harris from number 2 in the regime to number 1 gets more interesting by the week. I have to say, the Harris campaign has at last, 2 months after the party's elites and financiers railroaded her candidacy past any semblance of a democratic process, published a platform it calls A New Way Forward, and I will get to this in due course. I'm less interested in now in words posted on a website than in two recent developments we ought to consider together, even if no one has yet thought to do so. Slowly and very surely, it becomes clear by way of these weekly turns how a new Democratic regime, should Harris win on November 5th, proposes to manage the Imperium's business. And however many foolish voters may be illusioned otherwise, if Harris takes the White House, her business will be neither more nor less than managing the Imperium, the wars, the provocations, the illegal sanctions, and other collective punishments, the terrorist clients in Israel, the neo-Nazis in Kiev. Last Wednesday, September 4th, Liz Cheney surprised Washington, and I suppose most of the rest of us, when she announced she would support Harris's run for the presidency. The one-time Wyoming congresswoman, actually not so long ago, a coup-cultivating warmonger who remains among the hawkiest of right-wing foreign policy hawks, was not the first Republican to jump across the aisle this political season. She was also not the last. 2 days later, Liz's pop did the same. Dick Cheney, of course, needs no introduction. Instantly, the Harris campaign declared its delight in having the support of these courageous patriots, as the organization called them in its official statements. A week after all this high-caliber politicking, President Biden convened in the Oval Office with Keir Starmer, the new British Prime Minister, to consider Ukraine's proposal to fire Western-supplied missiles as targets well inside Russian territory. The Brits are ready to oblige the Kiev regime, as are the French, but everyone, London, Paris, Kiev, needs Biden's permission to widen the war in this fashion. At the moment, Biden and Secretary of State Blinken are in their, well, maybe, quote-unquote, phase, and we are meant to be on the edges of our seats wondering whether they will assent to these plans. But haven't we seen this movie before, and don't we know how it ends? Wasn't it, quote, maybe we will send HIMARS rocket systems, unquote, quote again, maybe M1 tanks, unquote, quote, maybe Patriot missiles, unquote, and quote again, maybe F-16s, unquote. Even before the Biden-Starmer encounter last week, Blinken and David Lammy, the British Foreign Secretary, during a visit to Kiev for talks with Zelensky, were already dropping heavy hints that Biden will once again acquiesce to the plans the Ukrainian president and the British Prime Minister will choreograph to present to him. The stipulation Biden and Blinken now purport to insist upon is that they will not assent to letting Kiev use weapons provided by the United States, which seems to be different from weapons made by the United States against targets in the Russian interior. This is no more than one of those hair splits in which the Biden White House trades when it wants to look thoughtful and cautious, but is neither. Will someone tell me what damn difference it will make to Russia if Moscow takes a hit from a missile sent from Britain, France, or the United States? As long as that missile is a U.S. missile, as long as it's handled by U.S. Specialists. I'm adding this, okay, as long as it makes use of U.S. satellite targeting data, as long as it uses secret codes, which the Ukrainians don't have any access to, but which needs to be used to actually fire the damn things. Going on with the article. These people are convening to plan the Western powers' reckless escalation of a proxy war. They have no way of winning, and they know they have no way of winning. Desperation is as desperation does. This is my simple read of these particular deliberations. Between the war planning and shifting political loyalties, what have we witnessed over these past couple of weeks? This is our question. When the Cheneys pair a pair, of course, is father and fille is daughter in French, enlisted in the Harris's campaign ranks, General Mally Dillon, the campaign's chairwoman, lauded the former for his courage and the latter for her patriotism. Elsewhere in the Harris, quote, hive, unquote, as I gather we are calling it, Liberal commentators stopped just short of gushing over Liz and Dick Cheney's political migration, ignoring the fact it appears to be mere opportunism. James Carden, who's James Carden? Must be James Carville, had a pithy piece on this. Cheney mania seizes the Democrats in the September 12th edition of the American Conservative. It may be James Carden after all, because I don't know whether James Carville would be found in the environs of the American Conservative. But anyway, quote, the wild applause that met Liz's announcement is indicative of where liberals now place their priorities, unquote, the longtime Washington commentator wrote, quote, and goes a long way toward explaining why they cannot be trusted on matters of national security. There is a lot of politics in the Democrats' exuberant greeting of the Cheneys. Of course, Harris people want to make the most of divisions among Republicans, and in the case of Liz Cheney, to exploit the animus that has arisen between her and Donald Trump. I'm going to skip over some other things here. I'm going to skip to his remarks on A New Way Forward, a 13-page document which outlines the platform of Harris. The 1.5 pages given to national security and foreign affairs amount to a screed dedicated to Russophobia, Sinophobia, NATOphilia, and, quote, the most lethal fighting force in the world, unquote, which seems to be Harris's idea of a diplomatic corps. This is how Steve Cohen's, it's the late Steve Cohen, who was a Russian expert, War Party thinks and what it sounds like. As a statement of intent, the Harris-Waltz platform is entirely accommodating of the Biden White House's very likely decision to escalate the Ukraine conflict to the point of risking the World War III Biden pretends not to want. The clearest, most sobering analysis of the Biden blinking thinking, is this my word? He asks about thinking, about authorizing Kyiv to attack targets deep inside Russia with Western-supplied missiles came from Vladimir Putin. The Russian president spoke last Thursday, the day before Starmer's talks with Biden, in response to a reporter's question. His statement is worth reading in full, given the obvious gravity he attaches to the West's deliberations. Quote from Putin. What we're seeing is an attempt to substitute notions, because this is not a question of whether the Kyiv regime is allowed or not allowed to strike targets on Russian territory. It is already carrying out strikes using unmanned aerial vehicles and other means, but using Western-made long-range precision weapons is a completely different story. The fact is that, I have mentioned this, and any expert both in our country and in the West will confirm this, the Ukrainian army is not capable of using cutting-edge, high-precision, long-range systems supplied by the West. They cannot do that. These weapons are impossible to employ without intelligence data from satellites, which Ukraine does not have. This can only be done using the European Union satellites or U.S. satellites, in general NATO satellites. This is the first point. The second point, perhaps the most important, the key point even, is that only NATO military personnel can assign flight missions to these missile systems. Ukrainian servicemen cannot do this. Therefore, it is not a question of allowing the Ukrainian regime to strike Russia with these weapons or not. It is about deciding when the NATO countries become directly involved in the military conflict or not. If this decision is made, it will mean nothing short of direct involvement. It will mean that NATO countries, the United States and European countries, are parties to the war in Ukraine. This will mean their direct involvement in the conflict, and it will clearly change the very essence, the very nature of the conflict dramatically. This will mean that NATO countries, the United States, and European countries are at war with Russia. And if this is the case, then bearing in mind the change in the essence of the conflict, we will make appropriate decisions in response to the threats that will be posed to us. Unquote. End of Putin's quote. Patrick Lawrence goes on. There are clearly people of sound mind within the Washington policy cliques who can read this statement for what it is and understand the risk the Biden regime contemplates as it inches towards an official decision on the missiles question, but these wiser heads do not appear in the ascendant. The prevailing view seems to lie with people such as William Burns, the CIA director, who thinks Putin is bluffing and nonsensically enough are willing to find out if they are right by calling said bluff. Here is a part of a letter 17 former ambassadors and generals sent to the Biden administration last week, as quoted in the Times. As you read these sentences, think about why the signatories of this letter wrote it and how it is they're as confident of their judgment as they profess. Quote, easing the restrictions on Western weapons will not cause Moscow to escalate. We know this because Ukraine is already striking territory Russia considers its own, including Crimea and Kursk, with these weapons, and Moscow's response remains unchanged. Now think about whether those who wrote and signed this letter, and by extension those running Ukraine policy, are sane or insane. Among the Biden regime's purported concerns, as it considers authorizing Ukraine to widen the war, is what difference attacks on the Russian interior would make. The White House and the Pentagon want to see a plan, it has been reported. It is a good question, asking about the point of this kind of escalation, but I am not sure an answer matters much to those who sit at the table in the White House cabinet room. As I have argued severally in this space, the Biden regime has foolishly cast this war as one between democracy and autocracy. Accordingly, it can afford to risk all manner of precipitous escalations, but it cannot afford to lose. Entering stage right, possibly on cue, Zelensky now says he wants to show Biden and subsequently Harris and Trump his, quote, plan for victory over Russia. The Washington Post reported last Friday this will consist of very few parts. Quote, all the points depend on the decision of Biden, unquote, the Ukrainian president said at a recent forum in Kyiv. As the Post noted, Zelensky is to date shy of revealing this point, but there are reports well short of confirmed that there are three of them. The first is the missile authorization. The second is the assurance that NATO will deploy air defense systems to protect Western Ukraine. And the third, you can get a load of this, is a guarantee that NATO will dispatch ground troops to rear areas of the conflict so that the armed forces of Ukraine can deploy more of its own troops to the front. These proposals, if confirmed as Zelensky makes his next trip to Washington, all align in one direction. The Kyiv regime's running theme remains dragging the West further into the war, rather as the Netanyahu regime in Israel is forever trying to do the same in West Asia. Zelensky, the Israeli Prime Minister, Biden, the world's problem right now, or one of them, is that none of these people can afford to lose the wars their hubris led them to start. The Anglos and the Americans are likely to make an official announcement about the use of long-range missiles against Russia after the UN General Assembly concludes its business on September 28th. So here, I have to emphasize strongly, Scott Ritter, Larry Wilkerson, Colonel McGregor, the people who are coming at it from sources from the Pentagon think that the decision to hold off on the missiles was not a temporary decision, that it was a decision that was made by Biden, which was forced on him by the briefing of the military situation of Lloyd Austin, and that Biden took the military advice, that he came to an understanding that if we pursued what we were doing inside of Ukraine, okay, inside of Israel, that we would become embroiled in ruinous wars that would damage, okay, the United States. That is what they think. Patrick Lawrence, though, thinks this decision was just a temporary one. Also, Professor Doctorow thinks, okay, this decision, okay, was a temporary one. I'm not sure who is right. I tend to think the people listening to military sources are correct in this case. I think that Biden has come down off the mountain. I hope, for the sake of all of us, that he is right, because none of us wants to face any Russian missile strikes using hypersonic missiles for which there is no defense. Going on, Starmer has recently indicated as much. In the best outcome, we will find Putin has rattled Washington and London such that they will step back from his latest plan to escalate. It is possible, but the U.S. and other NATO powers have not done much stepping back to date. We are well to remind ourselves. So I thought that last sentence was a good assessment of the situation. And I take the caution. Well, M.K. Bhadrakumar, the former Indian diplomat who publishes the consistently thoughtful Indian Punchline newsletter, put out a piece on Monday, September 16th, arguing that the Anglo-American powers are turning the proxy war in Ukraine into Russian roulette. Here is part, okay, of Bhadrakumar's reasoning. Storm shadows of the missile Starmer would allow Kiev to fire into Russia if the Biden regime approves of the plan. And here's a quote, okay, from Bhadrakumar. Moscow anticipates that the U.S.-UK ploy may be to test the waters by first openly using Britain's Storm Shadow long-range air-launched cruise missile, which has already been supplied, okay, to Ukraine. On Friday, Russia expelled 6 British diplomats assigned to the Moscow embassy in a clear warning that UK-Russia ties will be affected. Russia has already warned, okay, the UK of severe consequences if the Storm Shadow would be used to hit Russian territory. And by the way, I seem to recall that one Storm Shadow, at least, has already been used in a raid on Moscow months ago. It may be my recollection of this is mistaken, and perhaps it was only a drone. I believe that Storm Shadow was actually was a dud and did very little damage, okay, to the Kremlin. Anyway, going on, what makes a developing situation extremely dangerous is that the cat and mouse game so far about NATO's covert involvement in the Ukraine war is giving way to a game of Russian roulette that follows the laws of probability theory. We don't want this to follow the laws, okay, of probability theory. We want it to be governed by decision making. But Bhadrakumar has this exactly right in my view, but with one minor flaw in his argument. The Americans and the Brits can be said to be playing, unserious as they are, but the Russians are not. I think we should all keep that in mind. The Russians are very serious about these attacks on Russian territory. Our people, up to now, have been simply playing a game. It's a game that's been very fatal for the Ukrainians. They've lost 600,000 soldiers, okay, by the latest estimates. It's been deadly for the Russians, who have probably lost, 60 to 80,000 soldiers. Okay, it's been destructive for Ukraine, half of whose population, at least half of whose population, has gone elsewhere during this war, and I believe is unlikely to come back to the devastation that is the state previously known as the Ukraine. So, We may have been playing, but we have been playing, okay, with fire. The Russians are not. They seem to know exactly what they're doing, including in this matter of controlling, okay, the explanation, or the escalation, I should say, not the explanation. Well, I see there are 99 people here tonight. That was a surprise. It all seems to have happened at once. I don't see any more comments, except that D has arrived. Hi, D. Steve says hi, D. And Steve says he shared it on Facebook. Thank you, Steve. And D says she shared it on Facebook and X. So maybe 99 people are here due to D's sharing on X. I hope so. But in any case, thank you, D, for sharing, okay, on X. So our third topic for tonight is defending humanity. And that topic is based on another very good piece from Patrick Lawrence. Uh, I may not go through the whole of this piece, but I will. I will quote considerably from it. It's a very, very long piece. This piece is adapted from, quote, Defending the Humanity of Humanity, a speech the author delivered August 31st at Mutzur Ethic, a twice yearly conference held in Cernach, near Zurich, in Switzerland, of course. Anyone taking up the question of our shared humanity in the late summer of 2024 must begin with the mention of the Gaza crisis, or with the escalating violence in the West Bank, the wider Palestine crisis. These events are of world historical magnitude. They challenge any idea of humanity we may have until now held as truths held to be self-evident, as we Americans would say. That seems to be over now. It's as if an era in human history, in the human story, has ended, and we enter upon one that requires us to think again, maybe for the first time since the 1945 victories, when those who came before us looked back upon the wreckage of the 1930s and 40s and asked, quote, where is our humanity, unquote. The events that lead us to this point are diabolic, something close to sheer evil, and how strange it is that nation that leads us to this point represents the first half, the older half of what we commonly call, quote, Judeo-Christian civilization, unquote. Our shared task, in light of terrorist Israel's war on the Palestinian people, is to begin the work to wage another war, I would also say, in the cause of restoring our common humanity. This is war against the indifference various forms of power incessantly encourage us to cultivate. To wage this war against power means learning from the crisis that defines our time, that makes this a world historical moment, and then proceeding in a new direction. There are different ways to say this, quote, defending the humanity of humanity, unquote, is something that must concern each of us as individuals. How many conversations have I had over the past 10 months in how many different places wherein people ask, what can I do, quote unquote. I cannot count them. Everyone seems to be asking this. Posing a question is, of course, the first step toward answering it. Craig Murray, the Scottish activist and commentator, had a useful answer in a piece Consortium News published just a few weeks ago. Quote, the paths of resistance are various depending on where you are, unquote. He wrote, quote again, but find one and take one, unquote. It is good, clear, properly demanding advice. Craig Murray is writing about what we must require of ourselves as a matter of individual conscience. I propose to turn the question another way, in the direction of what I will call our public selves or our civic selves. I'm thinking of public space, the institutions available to us through which to wage the war I just mentioned, the war against power and defense of our common humanity. I have to add here certainly streaming on YouTube and Twitter and Facebook, okay, are today, these days, parts of our public uh, space. And one of the things I've been trying to do is to wage the war he just mentioned, the war against power in defense of our common humanity. But bitter reality is the next section. As I've mentioned, various commentaries, the Palestine crisis confronts us with a very bitter reality. This is the reality that our democracies, having devolved into, quote, post democracies, unquote, none of the institutions to which we thought we could speak any longer functions in this way. The institutions that are supposed to represent our will and aspirations are more or less broken. We have no way of expressing our objections to U.S. support for Zionist Israel's genocide. No way that makes any difference, I mean to say. The majority of people in the West favor world peace, not war. To take another example, surveys prove this. The majority of Germans favor coexisting uh, um, 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 uh, 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 and also uh, 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 having relations with Russia that are mutually beneficial. But in these and many other cases, what the citizenry favors does not matter to those conceiving of and executing policy. It is as if most people in the Western post democracies were unaware of this condition or only dimly aware of it before the events of last October 7th. What has followed suddenly pushed this reality in our faces. There is an extensive debate concerning whether ours is an age during which the nation state is fated to pass into history, and I consider this an interesting discourse, but I will leave it aside for now. I'm concerned with the viability and potential effectiveness of what we call, quote, the multilaterals, unquote, after many years during which they have been neglected, undermined, commandeered by the United States and its Western allies. It is an excellent time to turn our attention in this direction as we think about defending humanity's humanity. The 79th session of the United Nations General Assembly, which formally opened on September 10th, convenes its general debate on September 24th, 3 days from now, by the way, which concludes on the 30th. Very few people take any notice when the General Assembly meets each autumn, but I think this is about to change, or better put, has already begun to change. Among the many matters to be debated this year, sea rise and the climate crisis, also nuclear disarmament, the use of antimicrobials for human health, the future of Africa. There is a 2-day session called Summit for the Future to be held September 22nd to September 23rd. That's tomorrow, of course. Its topics will include, quote, laying the foundations for a invigorated multilateral system, unquote. So the institution is talking about the institution, the system about the system. I read this, a new self-consciousness is a very good sign. Let us consider at this point the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. General Assembly advanced the UDHR in Paris on December 10th, 1948, just 3 years and 2 months after the UN was formally established. Here is Article 1 of the Declaration. It is short and suitably to the point. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit, of brotherhood, unquote. These principles are of eternal validity, but try to imagine any group of world leaders or any Western leaders, more to my point, speaking in such terms today. This brief exercise gives us an idea of just where we are. A long way from home, I would say, in the matter of defending humanity's humanity. There are 30 articles in the UDHR, all of them brief, only one sentence. Article 6, quote, everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law, unquote. Some are remarkably pertinent to that crisis that defines our time. Article 15, quote, everyone has the right to a nationality. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality, nor denied the right to change his nationality, unquote. I am well aware as I imagine most people are, of how the UN has been undermined in the decades since its founding. Very soon after its founding, the United States, in pursuit of the global hegemony it decided was its right after the victories of 1945, set about subverting its high purpose to serve its own. In Defeat of an Ideal, a book published by Macmillan, 1973, Shirley Hazard, the late Australian writer, gave a good idea of the mess it had become 2 decades and some after its founding. Maybe you remember the statement of John Bolton, the repellent man, the second Bush administration preposterously appointed as its ambassador to the UN, to the effect that if the top floors of the Secretariat in New York were removed, it would make no difference. The gross abuse of the UN and its agencies is now common knowledge, and maybe, I have no way of measuring, something close to complete. The Americans' well known manipulation in recent years of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, is but one of the very many contemporary examples. Again, it is interesting to reflect with this corrosion in mind on how very far we have come in the wrong direction since the UDHR was written. Resisting the obvious causes for discouragement with which we live, we can then remind ourselves that the Declaration was drafted in direct response to the catastrophes that led to the Second World War and implied in every syllable of it a belief in humanity's shared capacity to right the wrongs that had so recently come close to destroying it. Our circumstances are not so different now. Uh, the United States' determination to prolong its global primacy has led the world to another point of danger, such that violence and lawlessness has reached catastrophic proportions, not so unlike those of the 1930s and 1940s. The U.S. is now generally recognized, according to various surveys, as the primary cause of global disorder. We should see the Palestine crisis in this context. It is without question among the most egregious manifestations of American power in all of history. And it is in response to this direct response that we find new and very important efforts to reconstruct the, quote, global commons, unquote, that the founding of the UN represented. Just a few years ago, a number of nations, all of them non-Western, formed a group advocating a return to the UN Charter as the basis of international law and the conduct of UN member states. This was not a very large group, and so far as I know, it has not made a significant mark in and of itself. It is the intent I wish to draw to your attention. The members of this group included, among others, Russia, China, India, Brazil, and I think uh, uh, um, um, South Africa, the BRICS nations, of course. We know from things stated at the time that these nations acted in response to the wild disorder occurring as the U.S. advanced its now infamous, quote, international rules-based order, unquote. The world had become too dangerous for these nations not to act. I recall when Moscow and Beijing issued their joint statement on international relations entering a new era in February 2022 that it was very clear they did so in part because they had become genuinely alarmed that the disorder of, quote, the rules-based order, unquote, had become a grave danger to global stability. I consider the joint statement the most significant political document to be made public so far in this century. We now speak rather familiarly of an emerging, quote, new world order, unquote, an order worthy of the term. And in the years since the joint statement, we have seen the markedly rising influence of organizations such as the BRICS. We should understand these developments as of a piece with the small group calling for the restored primacy of the UN Charter and the Sino-Russian initiative. When we see them in this way, they provide us with a pole we can use to reshape our thinking. This requires that we push aside the waves of propaganda that inundate us daily, anti-Russian, anti-Chinese, altogether anti the non-West, while also setting aside what objections we may have that the forms of government we find among non-Western nations do not match ours. Our forms of government, after all, do not any longer match ours, do they? And then we can recognize that the new efforts I described very briefly are at bottom in the cause of the validity and purpose of multilateral institutions and together the betterment of humanity, in my terms today, in defense of humanity's humanity. I know all about the charge that these thoughts are hopelessly idealistic, a token of sheer naivete and misplaced trust. These are the thoughts of those who cannot see forward, nothing more. Why, to put this matter to rest, do none of the Western post-democracies, rather than simply mouthing empty platitudes, stand squarely for a restoration of the principles embodied in institutions such as the UN and expressed in the UN Charter? I am suggesting, in short, that a reform movement to revise our too long abused global institutions is afoot and merits serious attention. A page is turning, to put this point another way. And apart from the examples I've just cited, a lot of good people are getting a lot of good thinking done. The other day, Jeffrey Sachs, the scholar, author, and prolific commentator, privately circulated a paper he calls, quote, Achieving Peace in the New Multipolar Age, unquote. It goes straight to my point. Sachs notes the United States' declining share of global domestic the gross domestic product, its overstretched um, uh, military, and its perennial budget crisis, and concludes, quote, we are already in a multipolar world. What kind of world will this be, he asks, and he then outlines three possibilities. One is continual great power rivalry. The second is that he puts it, quote, a precarious balance of power, unquote. It is the remaining idea that he favors that interests me. Quote, the third possibility, scorned in the past 30 years, this is a quote from Jeffrey Sachs, by U.S. leaders, but our greatest hope is true peace among the major powers. This peace will be based on the shared recognition there can be no global hegemon, and that common good requires active cooperation among the major powers. There are several bases of this approach, including idealism, a world based on ethics, and institutionalism, a world based on international law and multilateral institutions. Patrick Lawrence says, I end that quote. Patrick Lawrence says, I admire this observation for its combination of things we do not commonly think of together. In so many words, Sachs is writing about a world order in which humanity's humanity is recognized as paramount and is defended. Other analysts are digging deeper now into the structural flaws requiring repair. If the UN is to fulfill anything like the role for which it was initially intended. Some of these date to the UN's founding charter, but a good thing it is, and a measure of our moment, that these matters at last are raised. Hans Kochler, an eminent scholar who presides at the International Progress Organization in Vienna, put out a brief paper last week, quote, Sovereignty and Coercion, unquote, in which he identifies a fundamental inconsistency in the organization's rules and procedures. Excuse me for 1 second. The General Assembly, he means to say, embodies the UN's charter principle of equality among nations, but power in the UN structure is vested solely in the Security Council. In this passage, he describes what amounts to some disturbing echoes here, a quote, state of exception, unquote, wherein those who make and enforce the law are not subject to the law. Here's a quote from Kochler. Quote, a certain category of members of the Supreme Executive Organization of the UN, vested with vast coercive powers to enforce the ban on the use of force, can under no circumstances be legally coerced to abide by the law. For those countries, namely the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, quote, sovereignty, unquote, appears to be exclusive, in stark contrast to the Charter's principle of, quote, sovereign equality, unquote, of all member states. But for the P5, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the provisions of the Charter mean sovereignty in the sense of absolutist rule, the power to coerce, linked with the privilege not to be coerced. In other words, the law cannot be enforced against a permanent member or an ally enjoying the protection of a permanent member, unquote. Patrick goes on, okay, a book arrived just as I was composing these remarks that I take to be the most thorough treatment we have of the reform question. Richard Falk and Hans von Sponeck both served in the course of their careers as high officials of the UN. They spent 5 years on, quote, liberating the United Nations. That's their new book, with Stanford University Press, has just published with the interesting subtitle, Realism with Hope. This is part history and part prognosis. Falk and von Sponeck begin as I have, noting the unfortunate extent to which the UN is, as they put it, quote, less relevant as a political actor today than at any time since its establishment in 1945, unquote. Then proceed through a lengthy account of how the state of affairs came to be, and I admire their unsparing honesty as they do so. Then they rotate their gaze and tell us, quote, we believe that there will arise a new movement for revitalizing democracy, a stronger UN and a more benevolent global leadership. And we write with faith that in the end, prudence, rationality, empathy, expanded time horizons, and mechanisms facilitating cooperation and imposing accountability will emerge, unquote. Patrick Lawrence goes on, I take issue with only 2 things in this wonderful statement of purpose and expectation. No need for the future tense when looking for a movement for reform at the UN. This is already evident. And these 2 long-respected professionals are part of it. Equally, however high we may hold faith as we look at life and find our ways through it, the world Falk and von Sponeck anticipate will not come about by way of faith. It will come about as a result of what each of us determines to do to bring it about in our common defense of humanity, And that's the end of this article, which is a briefer version of the speech that Patrick Lawrence gave in Switzerland. I think this was a wonderful speech. I also think it's a call to action, to defend humanity. And I appeal to all of you to join this particular defense. It's really essential at this time, as we look at the expansion of the polls in favor, of Harris. And we begin to see that she is more likely than ever, to win. And as we also see, that there are apparently no plans from her to change our foreign policy. in particular with respect to Ukraine and with respect to Israel. And you can argue, of course, there's no indication of plans because the donors have her by the throat right now. You can certainly argue that, but that's neither here nor there from the standpoint, okay, of our actions. We, the people of the United States and the people of the world, need the institutions to be revitalized. We need the multilateral institutions to be strong once again. We need to call for this. We need to ask for this. We need to pressure for this. We need to have a movement that is for this. That movement has to add to other movements, such as the movement, okay, to dump the corruption here in the United States, and the movement to fix, okay, the climate emergency, and the Red Beret movement, okay, for Medicare for all. We need to have the movement to defend our humanity also become, okay, a primary movement, okay, among us. We must practice defending our humanity each day because the terrible war, okay, inside of Ukraine, and the genocide inside of Gaza has called into question our humanity once again, as much as the Second World War did. And we cannot afford to ignore it any longer. So that ends okay, our third topic. Now, I note that Steve Wolfbrand wishes us happy solstice. I guess it is a solstice. And he asks, is it the equinox? It's actually the vernal equinox. It's not the solstice. The solstices occur, okay, at the end of June and the end of December, and the equinoxes at the end of September, okay, and the end of March, okay. So here we go, and the Shobat Shomak Shuti says, a budget crisis? There is a budget crisis, but that's not going to be the subject of this particular stream, which is an international relations stream. And by the way, there are now 115 people here, so thank you all for coming. I've got very few likes on the indicator. I don't know why that is. Please share, like, and subscribe if you possibly can. That will be very, very helpful. Anyway, our next topic is the war, okay, of terror, and we'll talk about that through two vehicles. First, okay, there's an article again from uns.com, though that's not where. Okay, it first appeared. It's by Pepe Escobar, who says, this ain't no WW3. This is a war of terror. And Pepe wrote this on September 18th, 2024. Pepe is probably my favorite columnist in all the world these days. Here's a figure. It's a rocket, shoots into Ukraine, and it's labeled Ukrainization. And the face on the rocket is Zelensky's, Vladimir Zelensky's. And Russia is fighting an existential war for the survival of the motherland, what it has done repeatedly over centuries. And quote, this ain't no party, this ain't no disco, this ain't no fooling around, no time for dancing or lovey-dovey. I ain't got time for that now. This is from Talking Heads, Life During Wartime. First, we had action. President Putin, cool, calm, collected, warns, that any attack on Russia with long-range NATO missiles will be an act of war. And we had reaction. NATO rats scurrying back to the gutter in haste. For now. All that was a direct consequence of the Kursk debacle, a desperate gamble, but the state of things in the proxy war in Ukraine was desperate for NATO until it became crystal clear it's all basically non-recoverable, so there are two options left. Ukraine's unconditional surrender on Russia's terms, tantamount to NATO's complete humiliation, or escalation to all-out war, italics mine, says Pepe, with Russia. The U.S., but not the U.K. ruling classes, seem to have registered the essence of Putin's message. If NATO is at war with Russia, quote, and bearing in mind the change in the essence of the conflict, we will make appropriate decisions in response to the threats that will be posed to us, unquote. Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rybakov was ominously more precise, quote, the decision has been made, the carte blanche and all indulgences have been given to Kyiv, so we, that is Russia, are ready for everything, and we will react in a way that will not be pretty, unquote. NATO de facto war with Russia. For all practical purposes, NATO is already at war with Russia. Non-stop reconnaissance flights, high-precision strikes on airfields in Crimea, forcing the Black Sea Fleet to relocate out of Sevastopol. These are only some instances, with, quote, permission, unquote, to strike as far as 500 kilometers deep into Russia. That's 300 miles deep into Russia. And a list of several targets already submitted by Kyiv for approval, quote unquote. Putin has clearly stated the obvious. Russia is fighting an existential war for the survival of the motherland, what it has done repeatedly over centuries. Okay, the USSR suffered 27 million losses and emerged from World War II stronger than ever. That demonstration of willpower in itself scares the collective West, okay, to death. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, whose Taoist patience seems to be exhausting, added some color to the big picture, drawing from English literature, quote, George Orwell had a rich imagination and historical foresight. But even he could not imagine what a totalitarian state would look like. He described some of its contours, but failed to penetrate the depths of the totalitarianism that we now see within the framework of the, quote, rules-based order, unquote. I have nothing to add. The current leaders in Washington who suppress any dissent have, quote, outdone, unquote, him. This is totalitarianism in its purest form, unquote. Okay. I don't know if I agree with this. I think it's more like the inverted totalitarianism that was written about by Sheldon Wallen and more recently by Chris Hedges, who was basically a student of Sheldon Wallen. Lavrov concluded that, quote, they are historically doomed, unquote. Yet they don't really have the guts to provoke World War III. Trademark cowards, says Pepe, can only resort to a war of terror. Here are some instances. The SVR, Russian Foreign Intel, discovered a Kyiv plot to stage a Russian missile attack on a hospital or kindergarten on Kyiv-controlled territory. The objectives include raising the collapsed the morale of the AFU, justified the complete removal of any restrictions on deep missile strikes inside the Russian Federation, and attract support from the global south. The AFU is the Armed Forces of Ukraine going on, which overwhelmingly understands what Russia is doing in Ukraine. In parallel, if this massive false flag works, the hegemon would use it to, quote, increase pressure, unquote. How? Screaming at the top of their lungs, unquote, uh, uh, on Iran and the DPRK, uh, which is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, whose missiles would likely be the perpetrators of the carnage. As much as this seems far-fetched, sorry, I scrolled down a little too far. As much as this seems far-fetched, on a maximum stupid stand level, considering the deep dementia ranging from Washington and London to Kiev, it does remain possible, as NATO stand de facto retains the strategic initiative in this war. Russia, for its part, remains passive. It is NATO that is choosing the method, the place, and the time for its key choice strikes. Another classic instance of war of terror is jihadi outfit and al-Qaeda spin-off on Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria, receiving 75 drones from Kiev in exchange for a promise to send a batch of experienced fighters from the post-Soviet space to Donbass. Nothing new on the terror front here. Ukrainian spy Honcho Kirill Budanov, whose line eyes in the West is some sort of Ukrainian James Bond, is always in close touch with the jihadis in Idlib, as reported by the Syrian newspaper Al Watan. Okay, preparing for the Operation Barbarossa remix. That, by the way, was the code name for the German offensive in World War II. In parallel, we had the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell, the Russophobe, Sinophobe, who invented the, quote, pivot to China, unquote, during the first Obama administration, briefing senior EU and NATO bureaucrats about the military cooperation of a new empire coined Axis of Evil, Russia, China, Iran. Campbell focused mostly on Moscow, assisting Beijing with advanced submarine missile and stealth know-how in exchange for Chinese supplies. It's obvious that the combo behind the zombie, who can't even figure out a way to lick an ice cream, I think he meant to say an ice cream cone, is unaware of the interlocking military collaboration of the Russia-China-Iran strategic partnerships. Blind as 1,000 bats, the combo interprets Russia sharing its so far heavily guarded military know-how with China as, quote, a sign of increasing recklessness, unquote. The real troubling story behind this mix of ignorance and panic is that nothing originates from the zombie who can't even lick an ice cream. It's the, quote, Biden combo, unquote, that is in fact hard at work to preset the trajectory of the proxy war in Ukraine beyond January 2025, no matter who is elected to the White House. War of terror should be the overall paradigm, while preparations for the real war on Russia continue, with the horizon set for 2030, according to NATO's own internal deliberations. This is when they believe they will be at peak power to advance a remixed version of 1941's Operation Barbarossa. So, what Pepe is saying here is that internal documents that have been leaked from inside of the Pentagon suggests that the U.S. horizon for war with Russia, for the real war with Russia, is set for 2030, because supposedly the U.S. believes that we will be at peak power to advance a strong offensive against Russia, the strongest offensive since 1941, in 2030. I'm not sure I believe that for any number of reasons, including the fact that we're about to sustain that very serious defeat inside of Ukraine that's coming up. But going on, these clowns are congenitally incapable of understanding that Putin does not bluff. If there is no option left, Russia will, italics mine, go nuclear. As it stands, Putin and the Security Council, um, uh, 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 specifically uh, specifically Medvedev's incendiary rhetoric notwithstanding, are deep in the difficult business of absorbing blow after blow to prevent Armageddon. That takes unbounded Taoist patience shared by Putin and Lavrov, and Patrushev, coupled with the fact that Putin plays Japanese Go much more than chess and is a formidable tactician. Putin reads NATO Stan's demented playbook as if it was a children's storybook. In fact, it is. At the fateful moment of maximum benefit across the spectrum for Russia, Putin will order, for instance, the necessary decapitation of the Kiev snake. I got to think that's coming very, very soon now, because I think the armed forces at Kiev are about to attack. About to collapse. I don't think anything can stop that. Going on with the article. The nonstop, raucous debate on Russia using nuclear weapons essentially hinges on how the Kremlin will consider a NATO missile attack as an existential threat. But neocons and Zyocons, as well as NATO vassals, may desire a nuclear war, theoretically, because in effect this would generate a massive depopulation. One should never forget that the WEF, the Davos gang, wants and preaches a reduction of human population globally at a humongous 85%. The only path for it is, of course, a nuclear war. But reality is way more prosaic. Cowardly neocons and Zyocons, um, who are mirroring the example of the Talmudic genocidals in Tel Aviv, at best want to use the threat of a nuclear war to bully especially the Russia-China strategic partnership. In contrast, Putin, Xi, and selected global majority leaders, such as Malaysia's Anwar, continue to display intelligence, integrity, patience, foresight, and humanity. For the collective West and its appallingly mediocre political and bankster elites, it's always about the money and profits. Well, that may also be about to change drastically on October 22nd in Kazan at the BRICS summit, when major steps towards building a post-unilateral world should be announced. In the talk of the town in Moscow, there is a raging discussion across the board in Moscow on how to end the proxy war in Ukraine. Putin's Daoist patience is heavily criticized, not necessarily by informed observers with inside knowledge of hardcore geopolitics. They don't understand Washington will never accept key Russian demands. In parallel, when it comes to full denazification of Ukraine, Moscow eventually settling for a mere, quote, friendly, unquote, regime in Kyiv does not cut it. There seems to be a consensus that the collective West will not by any means recognize Russian sovereignty over Crimea, as well as everything conquered in the battlefields of Novorossiya. For those who don't know, that's the whole area to the east, of the Dnieper, and going all the way down to the city of Odessa. In the end, the prime evidence is that all nuances of Russia's negotiation plan will be decided by Putin. And that changes all the time. What he proposed quite generously on the eve of that pathetic peace summit in Switzerland in June is not on the table anymore after Kursk. Everything hinges once again on what happens in the battlefields. If, rather when, the Ukrainian front collapses, the running joke around Moscow will be, in effect, quote, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great are waiting, unquote. Well, they won't be waiting anymore because these were the greats who happened to de facto incorporate what is eastern and southern Ukraine into Russia. That will seal NATO's cosmic humiliation, hence the perpetuation of Plan B. No World War III, but a relentless war of terror. So what is this? This, by the way, was published from the Strategic Culture Foundation, which is a Russian publication by Pepe. What does he mean by a relentless war of terror? He means that upon the defeat of Ukraine and the absorption of eastern and southern Ukraine into Russia, the current war will end, but will be succeeded by a relentless war of terror that will be prosecuted by NATO, and by the West, using all the instruments of terror that the West is able to lay its hands on. Now, whether this happens or not depends on the foreign policy of perhaps the Harris administration, perhaps the Trump administration. We don't yet know which, of course. This also assumes that Biden may quickly, after the election, assuming there's no collapse actually before the election, and it seems that Putin is waiting until after the election because he doesn't want to affect the election to collapse the armies, of Ukraine. So if after the election that's what initially happens, there's a question as to whether Biden will accept it and accept the imposition of the peace, or whether Biden will initiate at that time a relentless war of terror, leaving that for the Harris administration or leaving that for the Trump administration. And there's the further question, will the Harris administration, which I think is more likely now, rather than the Trump administration, go on prosecuting such a war? That remains to be seen. The final thing I want to go on here, which is also about the war of terror. I want to go through a video, or part of a video anyway, of the interview of Judge Napolitano with Pepe Escobar on Thursday of this past week. And I am going to share
in Kursk and the refusal by President Biden to allow.
I'm going back to the beginning on this.
Hi, everyone. Judge Mr. Starmer and I know it's not past your.
Okay, sorry.
November 19th, 2024. Joining us from Moscow is our dear friend and dear friend of the show, Pepe Escobar. Pepe, I know it is midnight where you are. Thank you very much for staying up past your bedtime
Don't
I know
worry.
it's not past your bedtime.
The action is just starting here.
We have a lot to talk about, and the laugh that we just had may be the only laughs that we have during the show. I want to start
Wow.
with what happened last week in Kyiv and in the White House, where in Kyiv, Secretary of State Blinken and his British counterpart, Foreign Minister David Lammy, made it unmistakably clear that they expected Prime Minister Starmer and President Biden to authorize the Ukrainians to receive and use long-term missiles that could reach deep into Russia. Something happened. By the time Prime Minister Starmer got to Washington the next day, a very angry President Biden said no. In the interim, President Putin had given a very mild-mannered but clear and unambiguous statement that if this happens, we will consider the United States and Europe to be at war with us, and we will react accordingly. And the Speaker of the Russian Duma said, for those who don't understand, for those who didn't get it the first time, what the European Parliament is calling for leads to a world war using nuclear weapons. Do you think, and from your sources, or I should say it differently, do the Russians believe that Joe Biden finally came to his senses, or was there an intermediary like maybe the Pentagon and the Secretary of Defense?
Yes, the Pentagon as intermediaries, no question, because at least some generals, even if they don't have war experience at all, they know what that means. And Putin's interview was a masterpiece of restraint, in fact. It was a less than 1 minute interview in the street in St. Petersburg with the main square in the back and the Hermitage in the back.
Okay, let me comment, okay, at this point that that Pepe agrees basically with some of the others, Scott Ritter, Colonel McGregor, Colonel Wilkerson, that it was through the intervention, okay, of the Pentagon that caused the retreat by Biden. The Pentagon served, okay, as the intermediary, as Pepe says, and that it was their intervention that was decisive in, for the time being, diffusing the crisis that we were about to enter into on Thursday and Friday.
And he went straight to the point. He said, well, if you want to do this, it's very simple. The rules of the game will change. The nature of the conflict will change, and we will react accordingly. And obviously, NATO and the US will be at war with Russia.
Here is President Putin. It's 45 seconds long. It's exactly
Right.
as you described it, cut number 5.
It is not about allowing the Ukrainian regime to strike Russia with these weapons or not. It is about making a decision about whether NATO countries are directly involved in the military conflict or not. If the decision is made, it will mean nothing less than the direct participation of NATO countries, the United States, and European countries in the war in Ukraine. This is their direct participation, and this, of course, significantly changes the very essence, the very nature of the conflict. This will mean that NATO countries, the United States, and European countries are fighting Russia. And if this is so, bearing in mind the change in the very essence of this conflict, we will make appropriate decisions based on the threats that will be created for us.
Do you think that the Americans finally have come to the conclusion that Vladimir Putin means what he says?
Apparently, yes, Judge, but not the Brits, by the way, because Russophobia among the British establishment and the ruling class in Britain is something atavic, and it comes from almost 200 years, even before the beginning of the Great Game in the 19th century. But they are...
What he's saying, okay, is that, okay, it dates back at least two before the Crimean War, that was probably institutionalized by the Crimean War in 1854, or Jeffrey Sachs thinks this is the case also. Going on.
Realists in the Pentagon. And I wouldn't say they are realists in the Biden combo. Of course, Biden, no decisions at all. We know he's a zombie. The problem is the combo. And the combo is a congregation of neocons, zyocons, and lunatics, for that matter. And they think that they can provoke Russia virtually every week, week after week. And I don't know, Putin will never, he's always threatening with red lines and he doesn't do nothing.
Do you
They
think
don't
that
understand the fundamental. Yes.
Do you think Prime
Go
Minister
ahead, please.
Starmer on his own will allow these Storm Shadow missiles to be fired as far as they can into Russia? Because my understanding, and you probably know this better than I do, is that even the British missiles would require the use of American satellites in order to guide.
That's the most important part, Judge, because without America, the American satellite maze, NATO cannot do anything. So even if the Brits unilaterally, assuming that they have these storm shadows in Britain, which is not a given at all, those that were in Kiev and other parts of Ukraine, apparently they're all gone. So they will have to come from somewhere, from Britain or from Poland and Romania, let's put it this way. That's not a given as well. And still, the NATO maze is controlled by the American maze. And the most important thing is reconnaissance flights or the satellite maze, and all that is American, it's not European. European, as we know, technologically are a wonder, but a negative wonder.
Does NATO recognize that it is inferior militarily and in an intelligence, from an intelligence perspective, to Russia?
They will never admit it in public, but the fear disguised in all this aggressive posturing, especially when we had Stoltenberg virtually spouting out something virtually every day. Now he's going to go to another job. Yes, they recognize that they are inferior, and
he's talking about, of course, the head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, okay, who's leaving that position, okay, in favor, okay, of someone else. But the most important point here is that he says, in spite of the posturing, he thinks the Western decision makers do recognize, okay, their military and intelligence inferiority to the Russians at this point. So that is a very important point that he is making, actually rather casually.
They recognize that they are dependent on the US for everything. But the craziest part of the whole thing is that let's consider that we were possibly a few minutes away from the start of World War III last week. Yes, that was the case if we had this final green light from Washington, not from NATO in Brussels.
So he agrees with Scott Ritter, okay, and Colonel McGregor, okay, and Colonel Wilkerson that we were very near to World War III on Thursday and Friday.
The war that NATO really wants is not now. They want a war in 2030. And this is in NATO's internal documents and in this project, NATO 2030. They believe, this is what they believe, that then they will be re-weaponized with enough troops among all the vassals to try a sort of remix of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, using basically the Brits, the Poles, the Germans, the Scandinavians.
What is the
So this is what Pepe had to say in his column that I just read also. I have to add here that right now, one reason why the Russians have an advantage over us is that they have hypersonic missiles, of course, and we don't have any hypersonic missiles. But we've been testing them, developing them. One reason why we may be targeting 2030 for that really big war with Russia, or maybe planning for that, is because we anticipated that by then we would have the hypersonic missiles.
Perception of the war in the Kremlin, and what is the perception of the war on the streets, in the shops, in the homes in Moscow?
Exactly, and especially among businessmen, for instance, people who are in corporate leaders, people who are in tech finance,
Right.
people who are preparing the BRICS summit 1 month from now. They are. It's a mix of. They are fed up with the whole thing. Of course, they want the war to end, and at the same time, they understand that the Kremlin has its own timeline for the war, and they're not going to change their strategy. It's a war of attrition. They have gains, actual gains in the battlefield, and now also in Kursk. It's very slow. For instance, for the past week, nothing happened on the front, basically. So, and obviously, this is from a business point of view, it's a very complex and very multi-layered approach. There are people here who are making a lot of money out of this war, part of the Russian industrial military complex. At the same time, there is a purge inside the Ministry of Defense conducted by Belousov, the new Minister of Defense. And he's fighting factions inside the Ministry of Defense. So this alters more or less what happens on the ground. Of course, it alters a lot what happens on the ground in several instances. You have, for instance, every week or so, there's a general that is, this guy is mega corrupt. And obviously, this didn't happen during the Shoigu era before Borisov. And Putin has to maneuver problems with the Ministry of Finance before the BRICS summit. How are we going to proceed of de-dollarization, organizing the BRICS summit, dealing with the oligarchs, because there are a lot of oligarchs with double passports, interests on the other side, interests still in Europe, and at the same time, some of them refusing to invest as much as they could in the Russian economy. So Putin has to pick up the phone and say, well, show me the money. And on top of it, Judge, the fact that he's observing all these blows coming from the West and NATO because he doesn't want Armageddon tomorrow.
This are there hawks in the Kremlin who are pressuring President Putin to end the war quickly and with more aggression? And I don't know if such a thing exists. Are there doves in the Kremlin who are pressuring him to do something else?
Okay, before we get the answer to that question, when we listen to Pepe, based on his contacts, which are many in Russia, his on the spot contacts. Okay, we get a picture of what is going on internally inside of the regime in Russia, which we do not get from other sources of news. It's Pepe's contacts and his capabilities to get some inside stuff that make him so valuable to listen to or to read.
I would say that in the Security Council, there are no doves.
Okay, no surprise.
Definitely, starting with Medvedev, which is, for all practical purposes, the number 2 in the government.
Well, his rhetoric is about as aggressive as anything we've ever heard.
Because he's the one who he's free to go unplugged, as I put it, usually. You know, he can say what the other ones are very restrained. But now, even the Ministry of Foreign Relations, this is incredible. We are listening. For instance, a few days ago, Ryabkov, number 2 in the foreign ministry, he's the main Sherpa, Russian Sherpa coordinating the BRICS summit. Ryabkov said, look, if they go with this authorization to launch long-range missiles against Russian Federation, our response is going to be, his words, very nasty.
Mm. All
This
right, back
guy
to
is the model of his ultra contained, and they lost their patience already. All of
All
them.
right, back to the Kremlin. President Putin is perceived in the West. Well, I'm not talking about the neocons in that crowd; they hate him. But those of us who are trying to be objective perceive President Putin as a model of patience, being patient and methodical. Are there people in the Kremlin to his right who are pushing him to end this in a week, decapitate Kyiv, whatever?
The security agencies, Judge, especially people in the FSB, very, very powerful and very close to Bortnikov, the head of the FSB, and also foreign intelligence, Narishkin. The SVR, foreign intelligence, virtually every week they are discovering terrorist plots against Russia from all over. The latest one that they discovered last week is from Syria, and it makes total sense. They found out that Budanov, the Ukrainian James Bond, let's put it this way, is in direct contact with the head of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which comes from Jabhat al-Nusra, which many of you in our audience will remember that this is basically Al-Qaeda in Syria, essentially.
Right.
So they are in direct contact, and they made a deal. He sent 75 drones, Ukrainian drones, to these jihadis in Idlib. He sent, I think, more than 200 Ukrainian instructors. And in return, he said, look, I want a lot of fighters from you guys to fight against the Russians around Ukraine and near the borders of the Russian Federation. So this was discovered by
have they arrived?
Sorry?
Have they arrived? Have the jihadist fighters arrived? Are they in
No, not yet.
uniforms? Not yet. All right.
No, not yet. The deal is that first, the Ukrainians are going to train the jihadis on how to use drones. And then after they finish the course, there will be a direct line for them to go to Ukraine and near the Russian borders.
So this expands on his column in terms of actual detail. What's going on with that trade with the terrorists? Actually, a process of training the terrorists in the use of the drones and then importing them, to Ukraine. So why are the intelligence services so hot for the decapitation of Kyiv? And the reason why is because they probably believe that if the decapitation of Kyiv takes place, then these plots will also cease, because they think that these particular plots are coming from the government, in Kyiv. But I think one question is, if the government in Kyiv is decapitated, if it should fall, will these plots go on anyway? Because the terrorists, because the people making the deals, with the terrorists would still be operating, and they would be working in cahoots with NATO and the West to pursue the war of terror that Pepe defined in his column.
Is Russia prepared to fight the United States?
We're not there yet, Judge. We're not there yet.
Right? A direct answer to a critical question. We, the Russians, he identifies strongly with the Russians, of course, are not there yet, are not ready to fight the United States yet, do not want to fight the United States yet.
This is the long war, by the way, quoting Pentagon terminology, right? the war that we're just talking about a few minutes ago, the war that NATO wants in 2030,
Right.
Russia is preparing for this war. Russia is preparing for a remix of Operation Barbarossa, where the Americans would be obviously involved, because NATO cannot pull that off, even if they have 6 years to remilitarize, to have even 3% of GDP invested in weapons, you name it. They don't have enough troops, they don't have the know-how, and obviously they'll be bogged down if they try an Operation Barbarossa against Russia.
After the disaster in Kursk, what options remain? Well, after the disaster in Kursk and the refusal by President Biden to allow the long-term missiles, at least for now, what options remain for Ukraine besides recruiting and training jihadists who may never see the battlefield, because who knows how much longer the Ukraine government will last?
Well, it's what I defined as the war of terror, which is a mirror image of what Israel is doing against Gaza and now against Lebanon this week. It's pure terrorism, absolutely. Because most of these attacks, the Ukrainian attacks, are, of course, they are attacking refineries. They continue to attack Crimea practically on a daily basis with waves of drones. They continue to attack Belgorod. But let's say it's a sort of half and half. Military installations, infrastructure installations in the Russian Federation, but also apartment buildings in Donbass or in Belgorod, for instance, or even in Kursk. So it's a war of terror. And it's part of what we can define as the one war. There is one war going on, subdivided in different levels, especially between Gaza and Novorossiya. It's basically the US absolutely desperate to do anything to fight the end of the hegemony, of being an hegemonic power. So this is the overarching theme. And we can decline these themes in different parts of the world. For instance, they have successes in South America. Laura Richardson, the head of the Southcom, she went to South America and basically she said that you have to fight Russia and China because we, the hegemonic power, want to and want you to do it.
Tell me about Intel. How does the FSB and the...
Okay, before we go further, she may go to South America and tell people that we want them to fight, okay, the Russians, okay, and Chinese. Certain regimes in South America will do that. In particular, the Argentinian regime right now will probably do that. But most likely the Peruvian regime, it will do that because it's under right-wing control, okay, right now. However, Brazil will not do that. Colombia will not do that. Venezuela will not do that. Nor will Mexico do that. A large part of Latin America is no longer completely under the thumb of the United States. That has to be recognized and made clear.
SVR, the Russian domestic and foreign intel, compared to the Ukrainian intel, compared to CIA, compared to MI6?
Well, they are very well infiltrated in practically all levels of power and decision power in Ukraine. In Europe, is more complicated, not as much. For instance, they don't have the network that the MI6 has all across the West, and the MI6 subordinates, let's put it this way, or associates around, for instance, Central Asia or the Caucasus. But if you think in terms of how strong is MI6 from Russia to Central Asia and South Asia, the Russians have better intelligence in all these latitudes. The problem is, let's say that MI6 is very creative. There is an MI6 connection to what happened with the pagers in Hezbollah. And we had this information from a very, very good Russian intelligence source, in fact. So what the Israelis were doing, MI6 was following, and they had their own agenda as well, which is internal MI6 thing, a sort of revenge against Richard Moore, the head of the MI6. So the Russians know these kinds of things, which are ultra secret. And then one or two guys, they tell a few journalists and analysts, look, this is what happened. But this is extremely privileged intel information that the SVR, I think they put this on public domain selectively once in a while to show that their reach is huge.
With the YouTube Music app, you can start a radio station with up to 30 artists.
What
Okay, I think I'm going to stop it there. I think that's all we need to do at this point. I'm going to repeat what Pepe has shown us in his article, and here also, is that apart from the conventional military operations inside, of Ukraine and that part of the war, with Russia, there is a subterranean war of terror that is also going on. And even if we have the decapitation of Kiev, which very well might happen, it's possible, and Pepe thinks it will happen, that the war of terror will continue to go on, will continue to be prosecuted by the United States and by the UK, by their intelligence services in alliance with the jihadis in Western Asia. And that kind of terrorism will be used to harass Russia and continue the conflict until the West is ready for a larger conflict in 2030. So it's very important to realize that this is going on. This is another dimension, of the Ukrainian war, a very dangerous dimension. And whether in its continuance will depend on critical decisions that are yet to be made, first initially by Biden, but then continuing by either Trump, or Harris. And we must try to develop movements in this country, to pressure the administrations to stop this subterranean war against Russia, to actually come to a peace agreement with Russia, and to construct a new framework of security in Europe that we, the United States, endorse and do not try to undermine. That is the task ahead. And it's part of defending the humanity of humanity that Patrick Lawrence had talked about. If the multilateral world is to be strengthened, if the multipolar world is to be turned into a peaceful world, this subterranean war has to be ended following the decapitation of Ukraine, which is probably going to come, I think, over the next 2 months. I think the election is 6 weeks away. 2 weeks after that, maybe not even 2 weeks after that, but a short term after that, we will see the decapitation of Kiev and the start of talks to impose a peace settlement on the government, of Ukraine, a peace settlement which will probably involve the absorption of eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine by Russia, and the continued existence of the rest of Ukraine as a rump state. I don't know whether it will have access to the sea or won't have access to the sea, but it will be neutralized, it will be demilitarized, and it will be denazified. And in that context, Pepe thinks that there will be a war of terror that will be continued by the West, in opposition to Russia. But I think it remains to be seen whether this comes to pass, that we should recognize the possibility and politically work against it. So, there is a further comment by Duck, who said, everybody, just kidding. Very deep topics. I'm enjoying listening to something so solid and so valid. Thanks much, Mr. Firestone. 5 thumbs up. Well, thank you, Duck. Okay, I appreciate that. But that also ends our comments for tonight. My indicator says we have 125 people here. That is unprecedented for quite some time, and very welcome. So thank you all for coming. Please like, share, and subscribe. I will see you again on Tuesday, which I'm not sure that will be another show, okay, on international relations. My Tuesday shows are usually about that. But if things remain quiet, I may just do a domestic show on Tuesday. So once again, thank you for coming. Have a wonderful rest of the weekend. And good night, okay, to everybody.